Welcome everybody here at Google and watching on YouTube and on C-SPAN. My name is Derek Slater and I'm a policy analyst here at Google. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Harvard Law School professor John Palfrey here to talk about his new book, Born Digital, which he co-authored with Professor Urs Gasser. This book talks about the legal and social and political implications of digital natives, the first generation born into and raised in a totally digital world. And I can't think of a better person to teach us about this complex topic than John, who has really studied and engaged digital technologies like few other scholars. In fact, John is more than an accomplished scholar. He's also a blogger and a podcaster and a co-founder of several tech companies himself. And he's now Vice Dean of Information and Library Resources at Harvard Law School, where he's charged with really bringing the library into the digital age in their teaching and scholarship. And he's also a faculty co-director of Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. Once again, please welcome John Palfrey.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming out on this afternoon. It's an extraordinary honor to have the first stop in the book tour that we're doing for this book, Born Digital, to be here at Google headquarters. I feel like in many respects you have much more to teach me than I do about this topic, so I'm not going to talk for a whole hour, talk only for a portion of that, and look forward to engaging in discussion on a couple of topics that I'll leave us with. Derek Slater is one of the many extraordinary human connections between Google and the Berkman Center, which is my intellectual home at the Harvard Law School. Derek showed up on the doorstep of the Berkman Center, which used to be in a little Victorian on the northwest corner of the law school campus in his, roughly speaking, I think first week in college, if I recall, but close to the beginning of college. And it was my more or less first week on the job as executive director of the Berkman Center. And Derek said, hey, can I help? And I said, can you help? Of course you can help. And 4 years later, Derek Slater was still getting phone calls at the Berkman Center. He was a college student for Professor Slater that were coming into our research center. He hadn't even taken the LSAT, much less joined the faculty of the law school. But his blogging on copyright issues, Copy Fighters' Musings, had attracted such attention that it was a resource to the world, and people thought that he was on the intellectual property faculty, which I'm sure he could be if he decides to do that at some point very soon. So it's a wonderful connection. We also have many research projects that you all have been hugely involved in. Stop Badware, one chief among them, which is a research project that has 6 of us in Cambridge, where we sit in a room and look out for bad sites on the web. And when you guys find them and run interstitials based upon it, we then, from Harvard Law School, run an appeals process on the other side of that and have a big community of people. I think it's a great example of public-private partnerships between Harvard and Google. So there are many examples of this, and I'm really grateful to you guys for engaging with us, and hopefully there will be more after today. So the book that we've written on this topic really is ultimately a myth-busting book. That's the idea. So Urs Gasser, my friend from Switzerland, and I were sitting around and thinking about the extent to which there is sort of a culture war going around with our kids as the pawns. That there's a presumption, I think, that what's happening to kids in a digital age is overall not a good thing. I think that's sort of the vibe out in the world. There are 3 aspects of this vibe that I think are particularly concerning. One is a myth that kids, young people growing up in this world are bad, that they treat one another badly. I think cyberbullying is kind of the main media aspect of that. A second is that kids are endangered, that they're somehow more at risk in a digital age than they were beforehand. And I think the third one, which has been now popularized in a book that's on the market, that kids are dumber somehow than they were previously. And I think there's sort of a media feeding frenzy around these bad things. Sometimes media likes to say bad things about kids, and older people like to say those damn kids in various different ways. And I think this is kind of the current version of that, the generation gap between those who were born digital and those who were not, their parents and grandparents. So we started out with this project to say, how could we bring some good research to this topic and try to figure out if, in fact, any of these myths are true, and then try to define what does it mean to have been born in a digital age. From my perspective, I come at this really as a parent. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and within our house there's some disagreement as to how we ought to raise these children in a digital age, how much time they should be online and so forth, and whether that should be done any differently than it is elsewhere. Secondly, I come at this as a teacher in many respects. When I address a group at the Harvard Law School, every single student has a laptop in front of them, and they're looking down into the screen, not looking up. It's actually refreshing in this room of Googlers to see some laptops and some not, which I think is kind of a healthy thing, and we'll have a conversation about that. And then ultimately, thinking about this also as a lawyer, what are the legal issues that emerge from this, and what are things that we can use the law to fix, and what are places where the law really doesn't frankly belong? So it's really from those various perspectives that we come at it. The approach that we took was to read what everybody else who had done research in this field had come up with, and then to do our own interviews and focus groups with kids. And one of the hypotheses we had going in was that there's a global generation emerging. I think this is something that you guys know intuitively as a global multinational in this space. But what we wanted to do was do these conversations in lots of different parts of the world, not just in the Northeast in the US, where we did many of them, but also in Switzerland, also in the Gulf. We did a bunch in Bahrain, and in East Asia, in Shanghai and Beijing. And I think the basic message here, that there is a global culture emerging, especially among the most elite kids, is something that was borne out as part of that research. Kind of core takeaways about some of the differences and similarities between kids who were born in this way versus those who are older. I think there is a marked difference for those who are in this category of digital natives. It's a sort of a term that makes many of us squeamish, but we were trying to define it in a way that had real muscle to it. So the idea was, if you were born after 1980, how many people were born after 1980 here? Not me, but it's actually half the room, something like that. If you have access to the technologies, which each of you do, some of you in this room, and the skills to use it, all of which you have since you've been hired by Google, all those who raised their hands would be digital natives. The idea was to figure out what sets apart this group of young people from not only those older, but those also in the same age cohort who did not have so many skills, who were not as fortunate or to have access. And I think as we played out the research, that basic intuition was right, that there are many people who are born at this time and have these skills, and who do use technologies really differently, and it changes, in fact, their lives. But a second thing that I think was really important was many kids are not digital natives. So it's not something just simply the accident of birth after 1980 that makes you in this category, but rather the notion that you're brought up in this way. It's often elite kids from cultures all around the world, but you do need parents and teachers and others who give you the skills and encourage you to do it. Third was, as we went about this research, many adults complained about calling kids different, young people different. So they said, wait a minute, we use technologies in exactly the same way. And my guess is that virtually everyone in this room, myself included, born before 1980, uses technologies in much the same way as these young people. And I think that's also true. So as we were thinking about categories of people, we broke it down into 3. So one was digital natives, which were these kids born after 1980. Second was digital immigrants, those who came to this world somewhat later. I think you know them by the email jokes that are forwarded around, and the urban myths that are sent through to hundreds and hundreds of people and then forwarded along. And then third, digital settlers, those who, like Eric Davis in the back, no doubt, is in the digital settlers group, somebody who was there at the beginning and has in fact helped to shape the space and who uses the technology much in the same way. And overall, that there really is a global culture emerging. I was shocked at the similarities that we saw between kids, particularly the wealthy kids in places like the Gulf and in Shanghai and in Western Europe as in the United States. I think there are many more similarities than differences, and which I think will have profound implications for global culture going forward. So very briefly, and again, you guys know this so well, I will gloss over the research findings to get to the hard problems, but what are the attributes that we found of these kids who were born in a digital age? I would highlight 5 of them just sort of off the bat. The one that strikes you kind of most when you're having these focus groups with kids really is the extent to which identity is not just expressed in what you wear every day, but also in digital space. So the notion that you create a series of multiple virtual identities. It may just be your Facebook profile. Of course, that is the simplest expression of your digital identity. Your blog, if you have one. Some of the hybrid spaces like MySpace that have not just sort of identity features, but then also lots of creative things. Obviously, your YouTube feed or a YouTube page counts in that category. Very few of the people we talk to, but a growing number using the kinds of environments like Second Life as a place to express this identity. And then ultimately, some who were using the commercial sites also to create an avatar that could then go in many different parts of the web. And out of this notion, the idea was that there wasn't just lots of different identities for kids, but in fact just one identity expressed in many ways. And that's actually one of the paradoxes that we can come back to, which is in creating many identities, all of a sudden, they're actually more collapsible. And I blame Google and others as a force for this. But even as kids think they're creating many different identities, online and offline, somebody looking on, in fact, can often bring many of these identities together. It's good and bad, but it's a really different way to grow up and to express yourself. Second is multitasking. This will seem obvious. When you talk to most adults, this is what they point to as in the those damn kids category is they're always doing too many things at once. One of the most telling examples of this was in South Korea talking to young boys, and they were describing how they have multiple IM screens going at once. And it became clear that their game was how many girls could they be talking to at once without giving up the fact that they were talking to multiple girls at once. This is a particular skill that they'd honed in South Korea, but you can imagine different versions of it elsewhere. For those of us who are teachers, IM during class is a particular quandary. Many times you'll stand in front of a group and be describing something serious like, the future of democracy or a criminal law case in which someone died that's very serious, right? And all of a sudden some laughing will happen. You realize this is just not a funny story at all. And you can tell that people are IMing one another and making fun of your tie or whatever it is that had caused reason to multitask at that moment. Walking down the street, obviously, with the earbuds in their ears. The last frontier of the dinner table, many people, parents, who told us about their kids who couldn't have dinner without SMS texting their friends under the table with their cell phones and BlackBerries. Ultimately, many people expressing a concern. Is there, in this world of multitasking, in fact, contemplative space when kids are offline? We can come back to that as well. So a third attribute of digital natives, this one totally obvious, I think, to the Google world, since you are rendering all of this information accessible through your technology, but is they perceive the information they're coming to, media, as being digital, not in hard copy. So the obvious examples of this, Tower Records has liquidated its stores. Last year, iTunes became the largest music retailer in the United States. Obviously, the notion is they get their technology first, and then they get some digital media that comes to it. Nobody goes out and buys CDs. And we can come back to the piracy angle on that, too. Video, the extent to which it used to be all Hollywood, and now it's more YouTube, which is obviously an exciting thing in lots of respects. On the text side, we see this. I now run a big library, and students pack our library, absolutely pack it, particularly during exam times, particularly in the kind of intense zone of the Harvard Law School. But I have never once in my job doing this seen anybody take one of these off the shelf and actually start looking at it. That's just not what people do. It's a wonderful study space, and they're using it to access Lexis and Westlaw, something we have to come to grips with, but also something that has great possibilities, particularly with the Google Books project and other things, which would be fun to talk about too. And lastly, just convergence, that the notion that you can get all of this information from different devices. You see kids walking around with their sidekicks or cell phones and so forth. In our interviews, almost nobody, 99% of kids we talked to, had an internet-enabled device on them who were in this digital natives category at almost all times. So the notion that you have this world of information literally physically on you, I think is actually a really important trend. Okay, fourth, and again, these seem in this Googleplex to be sort of so obvious, but need to be stated, I guess. is the move from just being consumers of information to being creators of information. I think a profound shift from a democratic perspective. We found among young people what you would expect, some combination of people telling their own stories, their own narratives, unedited voices of single people in the blogs, podcasts, vlogs. Has anybody ever come with a better word for vlogs yet? Video logs? There has to be a better word for that. Photos and so forth. And likewise, the shared voices, these collaborative environments in which we're creating and recreating information, obviously wikis and Wikipedia being crucial to that. And then lastly, the overall relationship to information, which I think is really fundamentally different, and in some ways the thing that we should focus on looking ahead, because I think the implications for learning and for democracy are enormous. 100% of kids, when you ask them, how do you look up a new topic, something you don't know about. So we use Spanish-American War as one example in the US, or Lou Gehrig's disease. You're assigned this by your high school teacher for a book report. 100% say they open up a browser. Nobody told us Chrome yet, but the, IE or Firefox or Safari or Opera or whatever. Come to google.com, right? Type it Spanish-American War in, look for the Wikipedia entry, click on the Wikipedia entry if it's in the top 10, and then that's the point at which you get some divergence among the kids we talk to. Some are healthily skeptical of this. They realize that their classmate may have been to the Spanish-American War page a few minutes before and put in some different text to mess them up on their book report. They have a sense that this is possible. And then the less sophisticated kids just cut and paste it right into the book report, and you get these gaps emerging in terms of skill. But the notion that research now means a Google search is an incredibly profound thing for schools and for parents and for those interested in learning to come to grips with. I asked in these interviews of the kids we talked to, so did you ever go to a library? And these were younger than Harvard Law School students, so it's not the same kids I was talking about before. And the answer was inevitably no, except for one kid who laughed at me, said, "Man, go to a library. I went there once on a field trip." So the notion that a library has become a place to go on a field trip, I think is remarkable. Lots more that we can say about the relationship to information and anecdotes in that story, but I push ahead because it would be good to get to some of the problems. All of this is clearly happening in conjunction with technology that's being developed here and elsewhere. I think it's absolutely crucial what's happening in the Web 2.0 space, the notion, of course, that you can make content and then share it very broadly, and that you can participate not just in the making of content, but also in the making of code in lots of different ways. Kids are coming to a world that has very different contexts and meaning. So the number of kids who talked about waking up and looking immediately to their blog or some other place online to think about what are the comments that I got for the post I left last night, or how many friend requests I had, that's an extraordinarily different context for the information that they have put out there. And there's so many very specific technical things, but I will skip some of them to get to the threats and issues. But I think crucial to the story is this is happening at a point at which technology is advancing very rapidly, driven by often private sector firms like yours. And very often young people are involved in that development. So it's not that it's happening to young people. They actually are very much a part of this process. Okay, so that's just all descriptive, not meant to be good or bad. But coming back, I think, to this notion of the culture war in kids, the thing that you hear popping out of the research, particularly when you talk to older people, is the problems that all of this represents. Inevitably, the first series of concerns has to do with safety and security. So almost inevitably, when you're talking to a parent or a teacher, they go quickly to the stranger danger concern, right? Floods of government reports saying kids are more likely in some fashion to be harmed by people that they meet online than they have in the past. This is not, as it turns out, borne out particularly well by the research. I don't think there's anything that says that kids today, compared to, say, 10 years ago, are more likely to meet somebody who's then going to harm them, but there is clearly this concern out there. Second huge concern about kids getting access to content, pornographic, much as it was a decade ago. I think a lot of parents fooled that their kids aren't looking for it, which is one of those things you have to remind them about teenage boys and girls in particularly our culture. Third is this bullying concern. Clearly, there's a huge worry that kids are more likely to be bullied in the online space than they were in the offline space. And one important thing to pause on, which is for the first time in human history, this bullying is actually recorded, right? So one of the reasons that parents perceived, or grown-ups perceived, that there's more bullying is it was happening in the schoolyard before. It's now happening online, and you can see it if you're a parent, right? You can watch it happening. And secondly, it's actually recorded. So parents now have a view into the bullying that's happening, whether or not it's actually happening more or less. Of course, the concerns around computing security, which we're working on with Eric and the Stop Badware team as well. Very often your computing environment itself gets hacked, and this can be a cause of some of the problems. So second is privacy. There's I think a huge concern among parents that kids leave too much information about themselves online, that you're leaving mouse trappings basically for people to go following, or secondly, that you'll be leaving information about you that will be tattoos 10 years from now that you won't be able to get rid of. And in the law, this is actually a substantial problem, potentially. If, in fact, young people have a changing perception of what is something that is private, because we think about the reasonable expectation of privacy as the way in which we protect private information, at least under the Fourth Amendment, that as kids get to expect less privacy in some ways, that may mean that the law, in fact, protects them less. And that's an issue that we'll have to come to grips with. Third of the worries that you hear from parents is credibility of information, that if in fact research means a Google search and you type in to Google some search term and it comes back lots of information, some of it isn't going to be true. Of course, that was true in the books world as well. I can tell you there are plenty of errors, I'm sure, that we've inserted in here, and the fact that it's in a book doesn't make them right. But a concern that kids are going to get less valuable information, or that they're going to be relying on less credible information, without, I think, a very clear sense of what the new intermediaries are to help work through that. Fourth among the chief concerns is overload, that kids just have too much information hitting them, that in the course of a day, walking down the street, going to class and so forth, that you're just getting bombarded with so much information that you just won't be able to process all of it, and that kids aren't up to speed yet with the sort of searching and sorting tools to get through it. Fifth, the thing that comes at you from many of the schools' environments is aggressive behavior, that kids are actually meaner to one another, whether it's in the bullying context or it's just more aggressive IMs or emails sent to one another than ever before. It does seem like the online space is less likely to have some kind of a filter for kids, that in fact they will send something mean to somebody over an internet connection than they would in fact face-to-face. Sixth, the sense that kids are not as accountable to one another or to society, that when you're in an online space, you are somehow not as likely to want to have your personality associated with a certain act, that you somehow hide behind anonymity. And then lastly, the shared concern of many companies, as well as parents and teachers, is a lack of respect for intellectual property, that in the copyright context, that all kids are pirates, and then likely in the classroom, that they're ripping off information through plagiarism. And I think it's worth pausing on the piracy concern for a moment to say that most of the fears, on one level, actually are true from our research. So I come from a position on intellectual property where I like balance, this idea that there are rights on the one hand and also interests in the public, and that we should have some more balance in the Copyright Act. But it turns out that of the kids that we talk to, basically everybody, when you ask them under the veil of actual anonymity, said that they did rip off their music, that they got it illegally from downloading it. A fair amount of confusion as to what it was illegal, but pretty clear that they got it that way. And there was a few percent who didn't in the course of this research. And each of the kids who didn't get the music illegally did get it in digital form. And then you'd ask, so how did you, in fact, get this music? And they say, oh, we got it on iTunes. And then you ask one more question, and the response was that they had been given a gift card by their dad or their mom for a birthday, and then had downloaded against it. So if you think about it, it's exactly the same act, right, of downloading music that then comes onto your computer, whether or not you're doing it lawfully or unlawfully. That's how they're getting the music. The other sort of interesting social note that came in, if you did this in a focus group setting, you'd find maybe 10 kids who would tell you that they had gotten the music off of LimeWire or Kazaa, and then the 1 or 2 kids who had gotten it lawfully would inevitably be the well-dressed, sort of preppy lacrosse-playing kid. And at the end of that exchange, then all the 10 or 11 kids would look over at the kid who'd said that they didn't do it unlawfully, and the dynamic in the room changed a little bit at that point. But I think ultimately the discourse here is dominated by these threats and these particular issues. Definitely would love to come back to your perception as to whether or not they're real in a moment. But a lot of what we're trying to do with this book is to say many of those things are true. So it is absolutely true that many kids are getting their music or their movies or other things illegally. It's absolutely true that credibility is a real concern, and it's absolutely true that there's bullying happen online. But I think a lot of what we wanted to emphasize is that most of those stories are overblown in various ways, and we can sort of debunk the stories. But also to say so much of what's happening in this environment is really, really good and really, really important for society that we have to see all of these things together. So just to emphasize a few of those positive things, what is this sort of digital world good for in terms of how kids are using it? I think self-expression is one that we hit upon very quickly and with lots of kids, and I think is fundamentally important. Plainly, those of us who are involved in teaching, this is a really great way for young people to get engaged with information and then to recreate it in different ways. So in the course of a classroom, using a wiki as a way to tell a story about evidence law is sort of an extraordinary thing, that you can give a lecture, but then in the asynchronous moments have it, in fact, recreated. It's really good for the contextualization of information, that you can add all of this metadata to information that's out there. Right now at the Harvard Law School, we became the first school where our faculty agreed that we would make all of our scholarship available on an open access basis. So when we publish an article, we will say to the publisher, you can publish it in this journal, but you need, in fact, to let us put it online. This is something that I think is crucial to having our students, in fact, interact with that information, that it's in a place where students can contextualize it and make it available to other people through metadata that they might add to it. And I think lastly, this is sort of the geekiest and most academic concept in this book, is I think this self-expression is really good for democracies. I think we have to think about democratic activism in a different way, but I think if you think about it as the ability to recreate the culture that you live in, the ability to tell the stories of your time, the narratives of your time in an online space by writing it, by creating a podcast, by making it a YouTube video, I think there's an extraordinary ability that was never there before for young people to participate in the telling of a culture. We talked about the concerns about identity. I actually would flip that around to the other side. I actually think the fact that young people can express their identities in these online spaces can be fabulous. You can try on different things. It may well be that you will regret having tried them on later, but if you do it in safe and interesting ways, I think this could be a very positive thing for young people growing up overall. This is the sort of line where I talk about Google to other people, but plainly the ability to retrieve so much more information from so many different places, and the fact that young people have the skills to do it, again, I think is a transformative thing for global culture, that you can have access to so much information and plainly growing. I think ultimately also there are new art forms that are emerging that you can see both in the mashup culture, the remix culture, but also in the software world. The fact that that young people have the ability not just to create new forms of content, but also the code that runs on it. And then lastly, the way in which social life is changing is actually a very good thing in many respects, that the way that young people relate to one another, not just institutions, ultimately can be a positive thing and can actually lead to new forms of trust and new kinds of relationships overall. Okay, so there are lots of things to worry about, clearly, coming out of the data, but there are also some things that we should be very excited about. And since we're coming up on roughly a half hour, I actually want to pause here on the discussion point and open it up to all of you. But I would put two things sort of on the table that I think are, in a way, challenges to this community, because I think Google has a very special place in the development of where we go from here, whether or not in this environment that we shed more light on what's happening with young people and in fact seize the opportunities rather than kind of go in the other direction. So the first one really is to do with learning, which is right now in schools across the world, the wealthiest schools, to put it in simple terms, are wiring up their classrooms, right? They are, in fact, putting these technologies into classrooms so that kids can use them. But in classroom after classroom, they turn them off. So the Harvard Law School equivalent of this is 10 years ago, we wired up a really good big classroom. We put Ethernet jacks at every seat and a little ashtray that you could plug your thing into. And as soon as we spent $1 million on this classroom, the faculty's first act was, in fact, to turn it off, to say we don't have any idea why we wanted to let people kind of jack into this environment. Some teachers, my colleague Jonathan Zittrain noted that the only difference was they were playing solitaire before, now they could play hearts. And is that in fact something that we want to spend millions of dollars doing? So I was hoping actually to pause here for a moment and say, if in fact you could wire up all the classrooms and put smart boards up at the front and you could transform the educational space, and knowing that the kids you're teaching have the intuitive ability and all the skills to do it, why should we do that? What is it in fact that we could do for learning if we have this functionality built into classrooms? So I thought maybe I would pause there and see if anybody wanted to take up this challenge that is, in fact, very difficult for most schools across the world, even those who have the money to do something about it.
Well, you said something earlier, which I was going to ask about anyway.
Yeah.
It sort of ties into your assignment loosely, but you said something about putting all your scholarship online, making it open access, and I just wanted to understand that a little bit more. Is that all at Harvard, or is that just the law school? And basically, I think what you were saying was any published article has to go online as open access, which seems to me actually fairly revolutionary and profound from an educational standpoint worldwide, which is that anyone can access a published article written by a Harvard professor. So can you expound on that? What exactly is the program and how did that come about?
Great. If you will then stay there, and then once I answer the question, then you'll have not just a question to answer the question. It's true that last year, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which is most of Harvard, passed an open access mandate. It was unanimous, and the mandate basically said, if you publish a scholarly article, you can opt out of it on a specific work-by-work basis. But the default presumption, which is the key here, is that you will make available a non-exclusive right to the university to put it in an open access repository for the world to see. The Harvard Law School did exactly the same thing. So right now it's the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, which is the college and so forth, and the law school. There's some other schools have done similar things. Duke, for instance, at the law school has said all of the journals it publishes will be available on an open access basis. But I absolutely think this is a revolutionary thing for teaching over time. If other schools follow and say, every time we publish a scholarly article, we will make it for free available in a repository that Google Scholar and other things can crawl, and onto which you can put more data, I think we have a very different educational environment 10 years from now. So if you had that, how does this help transform education?
Well, you mentioned Google Scholar, and I think the frightening thing that you mentioned earlier was that kids go to research things, they go to Google, and then they go to Wikipedia. And I think we all understand the power of Wikipedia, and it's all very good, but there ought to be at least some, and we all hope they go to Google to do the research, but there ought to be at least some other results. And in this case, perhaps we would raise the relevance of Google Scholar results and actually make some real branded results as well. So you can go to Wikipedia, but you could also say, okay, what does Harvard say about this? What does Duke say about that? And those results right now, if you go to Google search, will probably be fairly obscure. So, as far as something we could do, have some sort of research product that might elevate branded results like that.
Clearly an opportunity for collaboration. But I think one of the things that we found that goes exactly to this question is the credibility problem, right? Which is once you get to the Wikipedia page in your the research mode here, it's very hard to know whether or not you should trust what's there, right? And I think where we saw the most sophisticated kids break out from the least sophisticated kids was what do they do next? So do they click on one of the links at the bottom to go to another source? And this is something that no teacher we came across was actually teaching, was how do you distinguish from different online sources? And I think this is where a collaboration somehow between the zillions of teachers out there and the technology companies that are building the way in which people are finding this is an enormous opportunity. And if you feed into that the fact that kids are often leaving, again, sort of tracks of where they went and how they interacted with the information, it does seem that there's an extraordinary opportunity that we're not yet seizing.
Thank you.
One of the things I find interesting about all this technology is that I see that it's really helpful in economics and processes, but knowledge is generated by people, by humans. Kids going to school, I think they need to have the interaction to have that exchange, that discourse in order to be able to learn. Having all this information available is great, and it makes it easier. Maybe we get rid of textbooks. We don't have to pay for them anymore because they're all available online, make it very easy. Having very interactive kinds of testing or things in the classroom because the technology is there to allow them to do that, I see was where the big benefit comes. But when it comes right down to it, even though you have all this information, we maybe ought to be having the conversation, that, like you mentioned, to teach them how to learn how to trust it or not trust it, how to validate it, and all those kinds of other kinds of processes around it, and not so much just being able to have the technology in the classroom and then have people online ignoring the conversation that's actually happening in the classroom.
I think that's exactly right, is to think about how does any given young person learn and say, what are the skills that they don't have right now to deal with all of this information, right? It's a huge opportunity to have access to it at different times, but different kids may in fact be able to process different information in different ways. So one of the critiques of the argument we've made is that young people are actually much less likely, according to some data, to read an entire book than they were some years ago. I'm not positive that I buy all the data, but let's just presume that that's right. Does that worry you if, in fact, they're learning in different ways, but not following sustained arguments in the form of a book or a long-format magazine?
Yeah, I don't know if it worries me. Actually, some of the notes I was writing to myself that I wanted to ask about were, I know there's new ways of learning, but when you come down to the old ways of learning, it was people writing and reading. And that volume, that rate of transfer can be very, very high. The technology, I'm not sure, has gotten to the point where you can actually create content in a way that's faster, as fast as you can by simply reading and writing. And so, I'm very happy that my kids still read tons more than I've ever read. But I think your point is well that, is it an attention span thing? Are they just not able to stick with it long enough anymore because there's so many different things in this very multitasking world that keeps their attention pulled away? I think it's a big concern.
It's good. One of the findings that we had that I didn't delve into here was how do young people get news and information? How is that different than the generation before? I think it's fairly straightforward that a generation ago, somebody woke up in the morning, they had a cup of coffee, and they flipped the New York Times cover to cover, right? And then maybe at 6 o'clock they listened to Walter Cronkite tell them the news. And you got a very specific form of information, and everybody had sort of the same set of information. And it wasn't you choosing what to get, it was what was provided to you in the standard format. What we found, sort of emerging hypothesis, is kind of a three-step process for young people getting information. The first was grazing for information, that they see headlines, lots and lots of headlines, right? It might be on the bottom of the TV screen, or it might be in an elevator, you're kind of seeing it there, or it might be just seeing the top of a newspaper, never actually flipping through it. Maybe it's an RSS feed, maybe it's the Google alerts that you have, whatever, but you're getting sort of the fact, right? And it might in fact be United Airlines declares for bankruptcy, and it's not true, whatever, but it might be something good and important. Then a second step for many kids, though not all, people fall off at every step here, is going for a deep dive, that they actually click on the hypertext link in the internet terms, right? So you graze for the headlines, and then something interests you. It's analysis, it's commentary. You click on it. It might be a blog post, might be a story from the AP. And then those who are most interested then actually get involved in a feedback loop. They, in fact, want to say something back, whether it's calling into CNN or it's writing their own blog post or creating their own YouTube video. And the sense I got was when kids go through that entire process, it's fabulous, right? If, in fact, what you're doing is grazing for information, you get the fact that you want, you then compare various sources, you talk back to it, you're actually engaged in it, that's an amazing process for getting news and information. If all you do is that first step, though, and you get these facts which may not be true and you don't sort them, that's very dangerous. So I think one of the theses of this book is we have to worry about this gap that's emerging between those who go through all of those steps and actually take advantage of all of the tools we create and those who are, in fact, just getting the simple version of it in a way that I think is less good than the New York Times and Walter Cronkite method. But yes, sir.
So I kind of see two problems in initializing all these technologies in the classroom. And the first is, at least very much on the secondary level in the United States, probably elsewhere, you use terms like digital natives, digital immigrants. Most teachers are digital aliens, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely,
They
right.
don't know anything about this stuff. And so that's a big shift that is going to need to occur because the instructor needs to know just as much, if not more, about these technologies than the students do, which leads into kind of the second issue is that access to information is so much easier with this technology that it makes it kind of easier to be lazy or easier to cheat. And so there kind of needs to be things implemented. I know like the university level, there's all these like plagiarism programs and stuff like that, but in places like high school, there might not be the funds or the infrastructure to have that. So there kind of needs to be systems set up that are somewhat big brotherish, not googly.
You said it, not me. Right.
Like that kind of fights against how, we in this room try to see the free flow of information. So it's kind of a trust in the indelible spirit of the human, but we were all teenagers and we know what we were like in high school. And
you made it through. You're standing here as a Googler,
amazing,
right.
So
And a Stanford football player before that.
Teaching people how to use this information, but in the right way,
Yeah.
I think is a big part of what people have to cover.
Oh, I totally think that's right. After we'd done our research, my co-author Urs and I were having a beer, as you do, sitting there thinking about, so what are we going to write? We'd done, gotten all this information, and he said to me, we have to have the courage to write this book for parents and teachers. Because at the end of the day, after we'd looked at all the data and talked to all these people, the people who were most in need of just an introduction to what was going on really were the teachers, ultimately. That we had a sense that teachers really want to connect to this generation of kids, but in so many cases, they felt just totally divorced from the world in which their students were living. And to some extent, the most good can be done by parents and teachers, ultimately. So on any of these topics, safety, education, in credibility, in privacy, the guides are the parents and the teachers, and if they're not, in fact, engaged in it. So ultimately, the thing that we wanted to say with this book is to parents and teachers, get in the game. In fact, let young people be your guides. Let them show you some of what's going on. And I thought a remarkable number of the people we talked to, young people, were totally willing to show their parents or a teacher, a MySpace page. Now, they wanted to show their friends' MySpace page, not their own, and they wanted to avoid the big brotherishness. And there's the usual balances of parenting and teaching. But ultimately, I think it's unsatisfying because there's not like you can just pass a law and fix the problem of internet safety. But ultimately, I think that is the way it's going to go. And maybe some time will solve this, which is young people join the teaching profession and are wonderful teachers and, in fact, figure out how to use the technologies. But I also think the existing core of teachers can learn it perfectly well to give common sense and good guidance. But I think you're totally right. Despite having gone to Stanford, you had it.
Similar issues. So I don't know if other people, parents, have seen this, but my kids, I have kids at this elementary, middle school, high school, and I've just recently moved into the Bay Area. Maybe it's different. Their teachers have forbidden internet sources. They don't count. So actually they have had to go to the library. And when they do research, the last one I said, why don't you go to Google, see Wikipedia. Oh, no, I'm not allowed to do that. Everything has to be in a printed material. So I don't, because you said that it was only a field trip where my kids have been forced into
going to the library. Yeah.
Well, a reference has to be printed.
Yeah.
I think 1 out of 5 can be internet, but the other 4 have to be physically printed. A magazine, a newspaper, a book,
Yep.
So I don't know if you saw that.
No, absolutely. So I cheated a little bit by making the problem, what does the rich school do? The school that has the facilities and in fact wants to engage with the technology and wires up the room. Most schools and most environments don't want to deal with it at all, right? The answer generally is to say, we don't want to wire it, we don't want to engage with this, and we do not want you citing to Wikipedia, worst of all,
Well, these
right?
are classrooms that are wired. They have the internet.
So,
there. It's not that.
so there's so we're described as a spectrum, right? There's we really want education to be offline on the one end, right? That's truly the kind of Luddite version. There's on the far end the just wire it at all costs and we'll figure it out zone of the crazy people, right? And then most things fall in the middle of the spectrum. And I think that's ultimately the challenge, which is there are times when laptops should be down. Right? You in fact should have a great Socratic dialogue between a teacher and a student. That's a really good way to learn sometimes, right? And yet in terms of getting access to information, it would be a crime if you didn't have access to all of these great forms of information. And very often, a scholarly article by somebody who knows a lot about it might in fact be in a perfectly good PDF, exactly the same thing as it is, in the printed version. And teachers do need to be able to say to kids, yeah, if you can search and find that in a way that you never would have found it before, you should cite to it, right? But that notion of a digital media curriculum or literacy around that is just not in the discourse right now. And I think that's leading to this divide between people saying, kids are just dumber, they're not actually engaging with it, or saying on the other side, we just have to absolutely, avoid it entirely.
But then to answer your other question, I've been teaching for 18 years, computer science, so maybe at the college level. But I can give two examples. So certainly computers in the classroom can be aggravating, and there's times when clearly they aren't engaged. But I've had examples where I was lecturing about a certain algorithm, and the student would actually be typing, and I think they were doing nothing related, and they say, hey, there's a cool visualization at this URL, and I could then pull it up and share it with the class. Or the other thing is people are always afraid to ask questions. It's sort of the broader thing of whispering to your neighbor, did you get that? Because if they get someone else that they can trust who may not be sitting next to them and say, no, I didn't get that either, people are much more willing to ask a question. And maybe you get a few questions right away versus the person coming up at the end of class and asking something you wished they had asked right away. So
I think it's amazing what you can do if you know how to use it and when to use it. And I think that's the thing that we're just not yet doing in classrooms.
So I'm interested by a lot of the perceptions of sort of the digital landscape, particularly by people in positions of authority in education or child rearing. And I think that there's a ton of potential to use the digital landscape in a way that's really, really positive, in a way that's never been done before, if those people in positions of authority know enough to do so in a positive way. I think that kids' attention spans are probably not getting longer. If you look at, kids who are playing WoW 80 hours a week, that takes a lot of attention. Might not be on the right thing, but it's a lot of attention. So I think that what's interesting to me is until the day comes when the majority of these role models are digital natives, what can teachers and parents do to learn to speak the digital language?
I really think it starts with a connection. It's basically get engaged by asking young people to be your guides, right? If you're a high school teacher, you're guaranteed to have some World of Warcraft playing kids in the classroom who will be glad to show you what it's like. And in fact, I think it starts a really interesting conversation if you go into World of Warcraft, right? Or you go into MySpace or Facebook. And it may seem creepy and you probably shouldn't spend all your time in there, but you shouldn't spend all your time where all your kids are anyway, right? They need to have some space to do things. So I actually don't think it's all that tricky to get it started. I do also think that there's no way that people who are not that interested in the technology are going to always be up to speed on the latest thing, and I think that's probably okay. I think that we could get a long way. One of the problems I worry most about is the safety one. I'm the chair of a task force that's been set up by 49 state attorneys general. You guys, Google, are one of the company members of it. And in the context of the debate about safety, I think much of the time, if parents and teachers were in these environments a little bit more and able to share common sense and then figure out what are the technologies that kids could use to keep themselves a little bit safer, and in fact, how do you work with peers and mentors and coaches and so forth? There's so many things we could be doing that we're not, and it really just starts with this connection that I think is not there. So I dislike the idea of a generational gap, because I think that's just the start of the problem. And so if we can figure out how to bridge it through conversation, we'll be better off.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's no inherent or there isn't a strict inherent difference between the generations in terms of what their attitudes are. That said, I think a lot of people are afraid of the internet, are afraid of the digital landscape, and they just think it's creepy or weird or nothing like they've ever seen before, and they're not interested.
Exactly.
And so on the flip side, I guess the question is, what do people who are in the digital landscape and who think it's a really positive thing, what can they do to encourage people who aren't interested, who think it's creepy, to sort of see their point of view?
So my view is write a book, right? No. No, I actually think a lot of it is about pointing out the cool stuff, the cool examples, the things that just couldn't have been done before. I think much of the time we reach for these new art forms, the notion of the YouTube mashup video, those kinds of things, remixes, which I think is awesome. It really is very cool. That's not a ton of kids doing it, as it turns out, many fewer than I would like across the swath of population. But I think lots of little creative things that young people are doing, whether it's in a blog or in a social network or obviously in these more advanced things, I think pointing out the extraordinarily simple but extraordinarily creative things that young people are doing to engage with information in new ways. And again, they're possibilities, right? They're little glimmerings. We end the book with a chapter on activism. I wanted to have the outcome of our study to be to say, kids are much more likely to get involved in politics because of technology, right? You kind of want to feel like, whatever your politics are, that the Obama/McCain, whatever world is going to be better off because so many young people are out there getting engaged in technology. It's not true, right? The technologies don't engage people who otherwise don't already want to be engaged. But there are examples of kids who are doing extraordinary things. There's a kid, Alexander Hefner, who started something called scoop08.org, which is just an amazing group of 400 young people who are covering the election in different ways than they were before. If those kids, in fact, see that their engagement helps them to say more in their society, have more of a voice, and in fact, change the outcome of something, I think there's a lifetime of engagement in civic life that's possible. So I think it is back to those who love this space, to all of us, is to say, find those really extraordinary seeds of change, point to them, nurture them, make them grow, help them grow, and then point people to them and say, that's the promise of this environment. And yes, there are these problems of safety and privacy and so forth that we have to deal with, but don't miss the fact that there's this extraordinary stuff going on over here.
Cool. I think you're doing
Cool.
good stuff. Thank
No,
you.
thank you.
So we've kind of already said this, and I couldn't think of anything else, and I'm too embarrassed to sit back down. But,
Good. Please do it anyway.
I think the thing that I think is promising about bringing all these technologies into the classroom, and I think it's a good point to encourage, especially the people that are afraid of the internet and all the problems it causes, is that you can really get in on the ground floor with these kids and be the one to introduce them instead. I think the problem with our generation, I think a digital native, is that we learned about the internet outside of the classroom first, and then the teachers came in and tried to apply it, and we're like, you don't know what you're talking about. We've been doing this for years, and the way you're showing us to do it is slow.
It's completely well put, which is it's about, how is it introduced? How is it in fact contextualized? And are you doing it in a way that resonates? If it doesn't resonate, it's going to be, completely, you'll be a laughingstock. And I think a lot of teachers we met had this concern, which was they tried ultimately to bring the technology in the space, but they were just superimposing something on top of an existing system that didn't work and didn't resonate at all, and they just get laughed at. They run away. It's sort of like learning a foreign language. I'm terrible at foreign language, and if I try to speak French and they laugh at me, then I don't want to learn it anymore, right? And I think the same is true in the computing space. So there's tons that we can do if, in fact, we start from that kind of ground level.
And even to be a little bit more Machiavellian about it, but if you give them assignments that involve these mediums, for homework assignments and projects, that points them to the right places to spend their time outside of school as well, and so they maybe won't be spending as much time doing other things that may not be in their best interest, and that they may not know it's in their best interest. So to kind of steer them not only in the classroom but beyond the classroom to be using that time in a more productive means.
Absolutely. So I just want to shift gears for the last couple minutes and on this. Please come.
It's a pretty quick question.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, you were describing sort of the demographic of a digital native as someone born since 1980, whereas I would make a big distinction between someone who was sort of born with all this technology already in their household, and someone like me. I was born in '86, and I remember the day we got the internet in my house. AOL 2.5 whatever. But so I was just wondering if in your research you make that distinction, because I mean, I can't even imagine what a 6-year-old does on the internet. Like, can they type? Like, I have no idea.
Can they type? Man, can they type?
If that was something that you looked at in your research,
Yeah.
the difference between kids sort of really born into it and ones who maybe just sort of came into that technology in middle school.
Yeah, no, you're totally right to point to that. So, you know, the conceit of the book, in a way, is to say a kid is born today. They are going to live cradle to grave in a world where they knew nothing else. They did not ever have a Sony Walkman, right? They always had the iPod. That's the world they grew up in. And so that's really what we're trying to argue for. What kind of a world do we want to create for the child born today? And I think it does matter to some extent. If you knew something before, if you got, you know, the technology in middle school, you did have a sense of something that came before. You know, it's too hard and too granular, I think, to answer, you know, what exactly that difference is. But I do think it matters a great deal, sort of when it's introduced and how it's introduced. I think this goes back to the last point, which is it introduced in a constructive way where you're doing it together and it's in fact something cool and important and you're building something, or is it really you're kind of left on your own to do it over there and your parents don't like it and your teachers don't like it and, you know, but you're doing it anyway and, you know, you end up playing World of Warcraft only all day. Not that that's a terrible thing, but, you know, I think a lot comes to, you know, how is it contextualized as part of your life? To what can 6-year-olds do? I mean, it's quite extraordinary, in fact, what 6-year-olds can do. I think you need to limit how much time 6-year-olds are doing it. But this was the last kind of thing I just wanted to put on the table, since I think the biggest potential negative issue with this, to say that, you know, there are a lot of myths out there, but I'm very concerned about the privacy implications of living a life exactly in this way, where you're literally born today and every bit of information about you could be recorded. I think we haven't figured out yet the sort of aggregate effect of somebody who's living their life with nothing that was before the digital times and actually was recorded. I am not a privacy nut. Like, when privacy first came up in the internet space, I was always thinking, what do those privacy nuts have to hide? Like, I don't know, you must be, you know, worrying about something. But I think the thing we have not puzzled out, and I think where Google and other companies that are asking for our trust in leaving lots of our email in Gmail or our health records or whatever it might be, even search data, although I think that's a little bit of a red herring, is how are we going to ensure together, especially absent a privacy law in the United States, that the information about us is something that we can control over the course of a lifetime, you know, of a baby that's born today. So if you think about it, the sonogram is, you know, the baby's in the mom's stomach. The picture is taken, stuck up on the refrigerator, but then it's saved in, you know, the pediatrician's office and in the obstetrician's office. And from there, you know, the baby is born, all these pictures taken, you know, records created and so forth and on, the amount of digital information that one could stitch back together, we just don't know, you know, how it's added up. So in a way, I'd love to, if anybody's willing to comment on this, which is, you know, is there a way that companies and citizens can do this, or do we actually, is this an area where we need a law that actually protects individual data because we don't know the impact of it going forward? This is the one area where I would say the myth is not outshadowed by the reality, that I think the myth may in fact be understating the case. I know it's something that Google has said a lot about as a company, but no one willing to take up the privacy charge, even Derek Slater?
In general, there is a need for comprehensive privacy legislation that protects users when it comes to other people who have access to the information. I think the trickier issue that you raise is how do you give users choice, control, and transparency about what information is being stored by third parties, including Google. It's something we work really hard at, but it's a challenge, in part because you're dealing with people with a range of different expertise, right? Something where digital natives may have an easier time dealing with it to the extent that they understand, okay, I've always stored my email with Google and it carries this sort of relationship. But maybe not, and there's still a lot more room for education, something I think we think about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of why I think the Google story is important here is when the Department of Justice came looking for a lot of search records and asked, AOL and Microsoft and Yahoo and you guys, you stood up and took it to court and won, right? That's a really important, I didn't actually think those search records were that big a deal, in that particular case, but it was exactly the right message, I think, to users to say we will fight it when it's, in this way. But that's an ad hoc approach, right? If every time it's just about sort of pushing back on a government request, that's not the same as you suggest of saying, how do I as a consumer have really strong control and data portability that I know I'll have and so forth going forward?
I was just going to say, I think before laws and other things can be made, there has to be sort of a change in understanding, at least on government side, and also I think on the side of intellectuals as well, those people who are making policy, is that so much of this is dynamic and so many things change over the course of days and weeks. Like Facebook, for instance, with Beacon, that essentially was a huge affront to privacy, and a lot of people were very, very angry, and that actually was taken care of without any intervention from the government. So honestly, it's hard to justify the making, at least to me, and I don't have the same opinions or background on this, but it feels like it's really hard to justify the making of a law which is so concrete with something or with a space that's so fluid and dynamic all the time. And it seems like there needs to be almost that these things sort of need to catch up before we can really even consider making laws so much as we make guidelines and do other things like that and really try to back it up.
So I think there's a totally legitimate viewpoint that says don't make law at the moment of the greatest transition in a space, right? Courts sometimes are, cited saying things like, this is a quicksilver technological environment. We can't fix it at this moment, and in fact, fix people. So I think that is absolutely true, that the omnibus, privacy laws like the ones in Europe end up in some cases doing more harm than good. And maybe there's a version of it that we could adapt here that would be helpful. But I think in many of these cases, we come back to the relationship between a company and its customers, and a customer base, which in this case is growing up in a very sophisticated way, but growing up exclusively in this, this hybrid world of digital and analog. So I guess I would end it in this way, since we're at an hour, with, in a way, a plea that the extent to which companies like Google are wildly successful at getting each of us and our young people to trust you with our data is, in fact, to honor that trust by virtue of having this conversation, as Facebook did with Beacon, I think, and with Newsfeed, and as you guys have in many other ways, because I think the difficulty of solving the problem of privacy over a lifetime that we have yet to figure out is likely something we can't answer very well with law right now. But I think that there's an extraordinary amount that technology companies who take public policy seriously, as Google does, to help in these areas like privacy, like safety, like credibility, that have real issues before our young people, and which I think really will have a major impact on the fate of our democracy and democracies around the world. So thank you very much, Derek Slater and others, for the chance to be here.